Tu m'entends, Dario, si je parle là?
Bah oui, je t'entends. Tu veux voir aussi?
Tu m'entends ou pas?
Oui, je t'entends, je t'entends. Tu m'entends?
Alors, moi, je t'entends pas.
Ah bon?
Vas-y, reparle pour voir.
A, B, C,
Non,
test.
c'est pas possible. T'es sûr que t'es pas en mute au moins, toi?
Non, non, je suis pas en mute. Normalement, ça marche, hein? Non? Ça marche pas?
Voir le son qui vient de. Attends, je vais essayer un autre site internet pour voir si le son il passe sur mon casque.
Attends.
Ouais, ça passe avec les autres trucs.
Alors, peut-être c'est moi.
Pourquoi ça marcherait pas là?
Morning, everyone. Paul let me know that he's, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, at least I can hear it.
Awesome. Paul let me know that he can't make it today. I believe Irfan's going to be here, and I think we've got most of the other people who are most interested are present already. So maybe we give Irfan another minute or so, and then we will get started. Does anyone have anything in particular they want to discuss today? Failing that, I would suggest we focus on trying to come to some consensus on an agreed upon approach to V2 of the API and implementation, and identify any specific sticking points. I don't think we're ever going to be at a point where we have a detailed doc where we have validated that everything is perfect or everything is implementable as described, but I think we need to at least say this is what we've agreed upon, and we will adapt it as need be during the detailed design and implementation. And we can do that in this group. Does anyone have any objections to that approach or alternative suggestions?
I have maybe an alternative take.
Sure.
I mean, my focus and Ivan's focus has been on prototyping and trying to learn things that would influence the design from that. And to my mind, I think that's been sort of a good, there's been learning that's come out of that. And my hope would be is that we follow a similar approach for iterating on the design. The idea that we would finalize or formalize like a design and then we're just going to run with that. I guess I'm a little bit concerned at that.
I think that's what I tried to say. But I guess the thing that I'm trying to suggest is that we don't not start designing or developing anything. Sorry, that's too many negatives. That we start doing the detailed design and development possibly concurrently now, rather than waiting to kind of reach closer consensus, if I can put it that way, or more detailed consensus. I think we're at a point now where, modulo some terminology and those kind of things, which are reasonably easy to change as we go. We can actually start building stuff soon, and detailed design and build of specific API types and specific controllers, etc. And that we can, as you say, iterate on those as we go. Ideally, we would have design reviews and code reviews, but those can happen in parallel with development. And part of that development will be the kind of validation and tweaking that you've mentioned, which I think is very valuable, to be clear. And I think there are a bunch of things that one runs across only when building these things that you can't, arrive at through thought experiments only. Cool. I see Irfan's here. I guess we can get started. Should we use the document as the basis for this discussion? If so, I can project it so that everyone's looking at the same thing. Let me see how to do that.
I saw your comment saying that Maru would be able to give a feedback on the document by Monday. Maru, is that right? Or
yes. I think it was mainly the sort of the simple case, which is more in the domain of what I've been prototyping. So I'll be trying to feed that experience back into that example.
okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just looking for link to my document. Hold on 1 second. There we go. How's that? Can everybody see what I'm presenting? Take silence as.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. So that sounds reasonable. Paul just suggested adding a note here that this is kind of a living document and is not cast in stone yet, but it does represent, what's in the document represents what we're broadly in alignment on. Okay. Sorry, I haven't actually, some of these comments just came in the last hour while I was commuting, so I haven't had a chance to digest all of them, but I think they're probably, oh, there's a whole bunch of green here. Not quite, okay. Somebody added all this stuff. Not totally sure. Oh, it's Paul, okay. I'll read through that offline. Doesn't look in conflict with anything that's currently in the doc or in my head.
I think I have maybe 2 things off the top of my head that might be worth talking, but only if nobody else has anything they want to talk about. So I'm assuming you do have things to talk about.
I don't personally. What I would like us to do is aim to, at the end of this meeting, modulo the additional feedback that you want to provide by Monday, identify the things that may be the most contentious in this document and see if we can resolve that now, today, in the next 45, 50 minutes, such that, you know, on roundabout, let's say Wednesday next week, we can say this is broad consensus that we've reached, and we're going ahead with detailed design and implementation on the basis of this. So yeah, go ahead, Maru.
I guess I would hope that we could have a consensus on what, like to me, I guess I'm mentally blocked by the idea that this doc is somehow authoritative and this is what people need to go and do work. And I mean, I'm going off and prototyping stuff, and I'm kind of curious why that isn't something that people can do as well. Like, it kind of needs to be some sort of basis for understanding, like, these are the common elements we're working with, or these are the common goals. But why does that have to be a top-down thing? Why can't people go, I want to work on this. Okay, what are the elements that we have to agree upon? Okay, let's agree upon that, and let's go work.
So, I mean,
I'm not talking about final work, I guess. That's my point, is like, let's go do a rough prototype of this and see what we learn and come back. And then, like, to me, that's more of an iterative process, and having this doc being the thing. I know it's not necessarily what you're intending. I'm just saying my sort of impression is we need a doc and we need it to be authoritative, and we can't do work until that's true. And
no, I don't.
It's such a big piece of work.
So what I would like is to have enough detail that we have discussed and agreed upon, so that we can go and build something which we can incrementally change, as our thinking changes, but that does not need to be thrown out the window and rebuilt, because our thinking has changed so much that whatever prototype we build is kind of so far away from where we want to be that it is, only useful for trying out things. I mean, I would like us to start actually building something that ultimately becomes V2. And I don't want us to be going backwards too far again and saying, oh, we've rethought all of this stuff and we're now not actually going to do what we agreed upon in the doc. We're going to do something different. That's sort of my goal.
Where is your concern stemming from, like that we would be moving forward and prototyping and then that would somehow not converge on something useful? Because that's, I mean, to me, the prototyping effort that I've been working on is more about de-risking like this exercise in getting something supportable. So,
well, in my mind, we have a set of requirements, and we have a high-level design, and we have a detailed design, and we have code. And there's obviously,
how can we do detailed design without actually having written it? That's probably the root of my concern. Is that
but we do need requirements, and we do need a high-level architecture, and it's easier to discuss and agree upon that in a document with diagrams and things than it is to dive through PRs and code, I think. So that's what this aims to be here, a rough agreement on the requirements and the high-level architecture and design, and such that we can go and build detailed designs and implementation that are consistent with that. Or where they need to be inconsistent, we can then go back and say, oh, okay, we thought we could do this way, but actually when we went to try and design it in detail and implement it, it turns out there was a bit of a flaw in our thinking, so we're going to adjust our thinking and put that down in the document as the adjusted thinking and move on, as opposed to kind of going round and round in circles. So yeah, I think we're actually on the same page, Maru. I don't think we have any significant differences in thinking there. Okay, so
so two things that come off the top of my head. One was, I almost wish there were line numbers in this document.
There's sections, hopefully that'll help. Let me see if I can.
So in the fully automated case section, where maybe number 4 in that section, there's a specification in the deployment of replicas being 300. And I guess my conception is that would be ideally part of sort of a scheduling preferences, sort of leave room for people who want straight replication. They wouldn't have a replicas field to confuse them. The template would be authoritative. And then if you were just wanting to schedule replicas across clusters in a dynamic or automated way, you would have a scheduling preferences resource that would allow you to specify the total number that you wanted.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I'm just trying to remember why I put it in here. Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. So this again then just basically the only thing in this federated deployment API object is actually a spec and a name, but to some extent, yeah. And
especially, I'm not saying it won't evolve into something different, but to me,
okay.
Let
me add a comment here to say move to what did we call them? Did we call them scheduling preferences? I can't remember what.
I think so.
Placement preferences.
So I guess I was just noticing there isn't actually a scheduling preferences, and what appears here is what we described in that brainstorming doc as scheduling. So is your intention for scheduling preference to be instead placement preference?
Yeah, I think the only reason I avoided the word scheduling is because it's so ambiguous, and leads, there's process scheduling, there's in-cluster scheduling, and this is actually choosing clusters and how many things to put in each cluster.
You wouldn't describe that? I mean, I guess the reason I think about it as scheduling is that's kind of how it was appearing in V1.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So we're going to rename placement preferences to scheduling preferences, and we're going to add the total number of replicas to that thing.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of my thinking. I'm not trying to say everybody's thinking that way, and if anybody else thinks placement preferences is a better bet. The only reason I guess it's a little bit fuzzy, like whether it's placement or scheduling. I don't think I'm too strong. I'm just kind of trying to understand why it appears like this in the doc.
I think just an oversight. I'm happy to move it. I think it could go in either place, quite frankly. But yes.
Well, like I think the replicas needs to go into this thing you call placement preferences. And the naming. I'm trying to sort of think about whether there's other things that would be more. It would make more sense to call placement preference, but I'm not really coming up with much beyond something that would be scheduling focused.
Okay. I'm comfortable with that. If anyone else wants to chime in or agree or disagree, feel free to. Otherwise, we'll go with that. I guess the main point that I think we need to be clear on is the distinction between what has been called up to now placement preferences, which we're now renamed scheduling preferences, the distinction between preferences and decisions. I think that needs to be very clear in everyone's minds and in the document, that there's a distinction between preferences, which the user specifies and says, I would like, this stuff to be in Europe and Asia, and I would like half my replicas to be here and the other half to be here, or whatever. And the output of some more concrete decision process that says, I want exactly this number of replicas in exactly this cluster. And I think there's a fairly fundamental distinction between those two. And if you know exactly how many replicas you want in exactly which named clusters, then you're talking about placement or scheduling decisions. And if you're referring to preferences, which you would like someone else to interpret and translate into decisions, then you're talking about preferences. Is that clear in everyone's mind and agreed upon? Okay, cool. You mentioned there was another item in your mind, Maru?
Yeah, it probably makes sense to revisit the discussion around the term substitution. And I think I have a little bit of a clearer idea of why I'm resistant to that term.
Okay, sounds good.
I think that we had previous discussions where you'd have the term template is maybe leading as well, but I have a template, and at one point we discussed the idea of having actual substitution variables that would appear in the template, and then you would have override or substitution, values per cluster that would be actually inserted in the template. And I think at least I've kind of moved away from that. And instead, it's kind of like it's an all or nothing thing, which to me sort of suggested overrides, which I don't think that there's a clear argument for overrides in that limited sort of example. But I was thinking about the current approach that I've been taking is simply I provide a field for a cluster, and that just is a simple override or substitution. But when I start talking about JSON patches and the potential to say take a list of things and add to it, take a list of things or delete from it, as JSON patch allows, then substitution starts to be a little bit less clear of a good term for me, because it's essentially it's modifying. The potential is it can modify the existing values, not just perform some sort of substitution operation.
Yeah,
so
I think I understand your. Yeah, I totally understand that point, and I actually totally agree with it. And I think wording is somewhat important, but as long as we use something that we all agree has a particular meaning, And ideally, that meaning should not be, you know, too far away from the sort of dictionary definition of what that meaning is. I think we're fine. I totally agree with you. The thing that I've been calling substitution is not simple variable substitution of atomic variables. Substitution might be, you know,
it might be that, but it could be more.
It could be, yeah. But the user might have said, you know, I didn't specify any container or set of containers or, you know, any other bunch of things in the template, and the what I've called substitution, which might not be the right word, would be substituting that, you know, blank space with a list of things. Whether we call that, you actually came up with quite a good word a few moments ago, which has slipped my mind, as an alternative to substitution.
Other than override?
Yes, you called it something else, and I can't think of the word now. The only objection I have to the word override is that it explicitly has fairly strong connotations, and I think I put the dictionary definition in somewhere, of, you know, somebody wants something and something else completely overrides that. So it says, no, you can't have that, you get these other things instead. And there's a whole bunch of examples in the dictionary of, you know, rulers overriding the desires of you know, whatever, the minions, etc. And I think that's kind of exactly the opposite of what we're trying to express here. What we're trying to say is, here's a broad set of preferences, and the template is you know, essentially is conceptually part of the user's preferences, and the substitution, or whatever this other word is that you came up with that might be better, is the process of evaluating those and then augmenting them in some way to produce an end product. I wish I could remember the word that came out of your mouth, because it was better than override. So yeah.
I never figured you for a social justice warrior.
All right, so unless we can think of a better one, so to be clear, the word scheduling in this the word substitution in this document is used more broadly than simple variable substitution. And maybe we can either replace that word with a better word, the one that you used earlier, or we can just define the word that we use, substitution, as to exactly what it means. It doesn't just mean substitute, you know, $X with some number. It could be create a list where there was a blank space, or add items to a list, or any one of those things. So I can wordsmith.
We're going to substitute substitution for something that is I guess I'm very kind of pedantic about language, and substitution for me, not so much like I can see your concern about overrides being triggering for some people, or just not, you know.
Okay, well, I think we actually agree I think we agree what we're talking about here. We're just looking for the right word. So how about we just go offline? I'll think of a better word, and you can think of a better word, and we can use whatever the best of those two is. I don't think there's a disagreement on the thing.
No. Replacement? It's kind of substitution-y. I don't know. I haven't suggested in the chat. Anyway, let's
do that offline. Okay, cool. I think we agree on that, barring TBD word. So where's a good place to put that? Do we describe that term anyway? Procedure, substitution, there we go. So we're gonna perhaps find a better word for this. It involves not only simple atomic variable substitution, oops. Okay, we'll.
So just a minor point of the sort of dichotomy between preferences and decisions. I've been just considering like where the decisions is kind of implicit. So I would, if like in my current way of thinking, I would have like a placement preference, then I would just have like placement resource. So there's no like decisions. Is that like, are you thinking that it's necessary to have explicitly placement decision like as a resource name? Or just trying to differentiate it for the purposes of discussion?
Don't feel too strongly about it. I understand what you're saying entirely. I guess the only question would be, you know, if you have substitution preferences and substitution and you use the word substitution, do you mean both of those or only one of those? So it's slightly clearer to me if you have, you know, two variants of substitution, the one being the preferences, the other one being decisions. And then if you use the word substitution, you're kind of referring to both of them. And if you use one of those specifically, but I don't feel super strongly about it. So if you want to remove the word decision from there and say that substitution preferences beget actual substitutions, that's fine.
I guess I think I will probably do that. And my rationale is that preferences is kind of a generic catch-all for different mechanisms for defining user preferences or admin preferences. And the decision is kind of what it boils down to. And so it's specific versus general.
Yeah. I think we're talking about the same thing. I think all we're debating is whether the word decisions is superfluous or not. I could go either way. I don't really care.
Okay.
Okay. Was there anything else? I feel a bit bad that there are only two people speaking in this discussion. Has anyone else got any feelings, opinions?
Yeah, I had a couple of points or questions which I wanted we better discuss. For example, I am not very clear on if this particular workflow or the workflows which are represented in the diagram, they are sort of authoritative. For example, for the reference implementation that we do in the community, or that is just one of the implementations that we will decide on, and there are multiple possible workflows. For example, I wrote one comment here saying that there is a possibility that you don't have different other resources, aka cluster placement preferences, placement decisions, and all those things are not there. Only base predicted resource and template is there, and propagation config is there. Should that be sufficient for somebody to implement a complete workflow using whatever mechanism they choose to? Might be active controllers or something.
Yeah.
Some model.
I think that's a valid question, and I think off the top of my head, the answer is that if you want your code and APIs to kind of coexist with others that other people have built, you need to have some kind of rendezvous points for those different pieces of code. And currently those rendezvous points are these API objects. If you wanted to implement, let's say, a single controller that did all of this stuff and had, you know, one set of inputs which perhaps encompassed all of cluster preference, placement preferences, template substitutions, propagation configuration, all of that, you know, maybe you put that in some other third-party resource that's called something completely different, and you implement a single controller that takes all of that as input and, you know, does either a reconciliation loop or a once-off workflow, then I think you can, you know, nobody's going to stop you from doing that, but it means that nobody else's propagation controller or anything will work, or nobody else's template substitution or scheduler will work with your code or with your objects. And if you do want to, you know, allow other alternative schedulers or template substitution mechanisms or policy plugins, etc., those external agents at the top right of the document, then you need to kind of adhere to this thing. That's my thinking, at least. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So if I am thinking clearly, what I have understood so far is that as a result of all this exercise that we are doing, we would ideally converge to a particular API spec, and probably some other controller implementations also. But the main point of convergence would be the API spec for all these objects, and that we should be all, or whoever is implementing should have a common
Yes,
agreement.
yes, I think that is the goal, and I think we need an API spec for. So we need a sort of a general agreement, which I think we've pretty much arrived at now, as to what all the specific implementations look like. So for each type, we might have, for example, I think we're going to probably end up with a fairly generic template substitution mechanism, and maybe cluster placement preferences, which we've renamed to something else now. But I think we can aim to have like as much commonality there as possible across all the different types that we support. But where was I going with all of this now? So yes, I think we do need to agree on those, and we might, if somebody does the detailed design for federated type X, whatever that may be, and they discover that the generic template substitution or placement preferences does not work properly for that, they can either enhance the generic thing and say we need to enhance it in order to support this new type, federated HPA or whatever it happens to be, or they can augment it with some other stuff for that type, which is only useful for that type, and therefore we do some like special stuff for that type. That's sort of the direction I'm thinking of. It's one other brief comment to sort of go back a little bit is that the implementation V1 that we currently have, going back to your previous comment, Irfan, basically it has cluster preference placements, cluster placement preferences, template substitution preferences, and what else? And yeah, it has all of that contained in annotations on the base type, and it also updates the base type with what we've called propagation status here. So you can see, how many of your replicas are running, etc. So that is an instance of what you mentioned earlier, sort of a non-conformant implementation of this.
Yeah.
But I do think that to the extent that we want to make this flexible and allow people to customize their schedulers or do fancy template substitution and implement, policy enforcement, etc., I think we do need to have a reasonable standard that people can plug all those things into. And the intention of this document is to kind of agree on the high level architecture and design of that. Cool.
Yeah. One more question, Quinton. So
Sure.
this came up while I was discussing this talk with Shashi. So he's not there in the meeting, but I'm just representing him sort of. So he asked me this question. So should we also define a particular user-facing behavior for this? For example, the implementation and the API could be a specific API, okay? But the user of the API should ideally, should we define that the user of the API will get a consistent behavior of whichever implementation he's looking at, or it could be a behavior which is depending on the implementation of controllers.
Do you have a concrete example of consistent or inconsistent?
Yes. For example, one implementation could be in the absence of cluster placement preferences. One implementation could be that the objects would not be propagated into the clusters at all. The other implementation could be that in the absence of cluster placement preferences, the default behavior is that they'll be propagated to all the objects because this particular object is missing. That means it's a default behavior of the implementation that it just propagates to all the clusters.
Yeah, that's a valid question, and I don't know what the best answer to it is. I guess it boils down to what the defaults are for some of these things. I could go either way. I mean, what I do know is that if there are no cluster placement decisions, nothing will be substituted into the templates, and therefore the templates, the substitution outputs, looking at the document, will not exist unless somebody puts them there manually, and therefore propagation won't happen because it doesn't have its inputs. But what happens if, so maybe that would be a useful discussion, like what exactly happens if there are 5 stacks of blue cards, sorry, 6 stacks of blue cards in the diagram, starting at the top left, cluster placement preferences, cluster placement decisions, template substitution preferences, substitution outputs, and propagation config. So a valid question would be, for each one of those stacks of cards, how is the system expected to behave if it doesn't exist?
Let me put a little more perspective to the question. For example, Shashi exactly asked me that as implementers or a reference implementer in open source, should we define, as part of this exercise that we are doing, because we are trying to come at consensus, should we define that users who interact with whichever implementation of this API ideally get a consistent experience, right? Or my answer was, I have a different opinion. My answer was that ideally we should actually, the implementation of the API defines what the user behavior is. So for example, Red Hat is implementing in their OpenShift environment, the implementation of this API. They can have an implementation which probably is suitable to Red Hat's point of view. Yeah. Or somebody else can have a implementation which is suitable to a different user experience. And the user experiences can differ in both the implementations. Does that sound logical?
Yes, it does. And now that you mention that, now that I think of it a bit, I think the default should be, and this is like a proposal for discussion, that if any of those are missing, the default behavior is for nothing to happen. And if you want,
I mean, that could be part of the reference spec.
Yeah. And you disagree. So let me just finish for a second, Maru.
Sure.
And if you want something different than that, you need to, and this, we'll have to get to the specifics of the arrows in the diagram, but in principle, you need to write, there needs to be some kind of piece of code that generates the necessary things to make the workflow proceed, or a user has to add the missing bits. So cluster placement preferences are actually only a requirement for scheduling. And so if you don't have a scheduler and it doesn't need to proceed, you don't need any of those. And the default is, if the user doesn't provide them, the default is that cluster placement scheduling won't happen, which seems reasonable. However, caveat there is that the output of cluster placement is not a requirement for template substitution, because template substitution can take a base federated resources input, a cluster placement decision, and a template substitution preference, and the workflow can proceed from there. So if you have those 3 things, template substitution will happen. By default, if you're missing substitution preferences or cluster placement decisions, which I think we've called whatever, something different, then template substitution won't happen. And if you want it to happen, you need to create those things or have a piece of software create the default versions of those things for you. So that's a proposal. Sorry, Maru, carry on.
I think I think that what you're describing makes sense when you have a scheduler involved. If you weren't involving a scheduler, I think the minimum requirement is a template and a placement decision, and not necessarily as you're calling, substitution preferences. I mean, I'm kind of thinking more a little bit lower level. I would say like substitution decision. The reconciler that I've been working with basically will...
It's a substitution output, by the way.
I mean, the idea of template substitution, to me, I'm having a little, I don't know, sometimes I can't hold two things in my head, but for a given cluster, like in a reconcile loop, for a given cluster, I say get object for cluster. And I'll pass the template, the placement, and the overrides or substitution resource. And that'll return an object or it won't. Actually, no, in this case, it's just always returning an object because the decision, like the placement, is actually considered before. Sorry, so the get object for cluster basically just requires the template and the overrides. And if you don't have overrides, there's nothing required. Like you can still just provide the template. Sorry, you can generate the resources that should appear in the cluster without the overrides in the case of not using a scheduler. I think we've discussed that when you have a scheduler, you kind of require that the substitution decision or whatever appears just because otherwise you don't know that scheduling has been performed. But without a scheduler, you really just need a placement and a template. Here, you know, what do I want to put in and where do I want to put it?
But you also have to, I think I'm in line with you here. What I'm trying to figure out is something has to tell, so I think you do have a template substitution procedure in your mind. So there is a step where you take a template, which is on the far left of the diagram, and you take a cluster placement decision, which is, I want this in cluster A, B, and C, and you then produce something that needs to get propagated. Or in the case of A, B, and C, you produce 3 different things. Each one needs to be propagated to a different cluster.
Just one quibble with that is that determining where resources are going to go is separate from determining their representation in my mind, and it seems to me that template substitution in this example is maybe pushing them together.
No, it actually explicitly pulls them apart. But
the placement decision is going into like the template substitution thing.
Yes, but the thing that produces the cluster placement decision is entirely different than the thing that substitutes those into the template.
Right. For me, like, I would be iterating over the clusters that I did want to, that this resource should go into. And for each cluster, I would be determining the object representation based on the template and the substitution. So
yes, that's the substitution output in the diagram, which we're going to potentially rename, but that's what that blue box at the bottom right intends to represent, the output of that thing you just described.
Okay, so template template substitution for me is that term is a little bit, it doesn't really represent what I'm describing for me, but yeah, I guess I understand it means the same thing.
So the top right-hand corner, the template substitution preferences, I can't remember if I defined that in any better detail in the document, but the intention there was like something that tells that pink box called, or that pink ellipse called template substitution, how to apply cluster placement decisions into the template and produce an output. Yeah.
Can we rename?
Maybe that's just a configuration of the substitution engine. Sorry, Irfan, carry on.
Yeah, substitution output can be more specific. For example, per cluster object or per cluster representation.
Yes, I agree. That's exactly what it is. And maybe we do need to be more specific with the name. I agree. That is a Kubernetes resource with
Correct.
a cluster label on it saying, push this resource into this cluster.
Correct. Correct. So something
Or
cluster.
pull it into that cluster, whichever way,
Yeah.
propagate it into that cluster.
So probably because the substitution term is used at two different places, it's getting a confusion.
Let's make a note. I agree with you. Here we go. Where did we put it here? So I'll just make a note here. Oh, there we go. Outputs. Okay, does that capture what you were saying, Irfan?
Yeah, sort of. No, but I'm not sure if the discussion you and Maru were having that is resolved by this alone. So, Maru, you can chime in.
Well, so I think the question actually revolves around this thing here. Does it exist, or what does it look like? So I think that's what I was. So now I remember what I meant by that box. I think there's a simple case, which is perhaps the one you have in mind, Maru, where that is all encoded in the substitution engine, but it seems like there's a more general case there, which says that somebody decided which clusters to put this resource into, and then there's a set of rules for taking that set of decisions of which clusters to place it in, and then generating Kubernetes resources based on the template provided. And the logic in the configuration or the input into that process could be more complicated than always just put the cluster name in the field that says cluster name. It could be more complex than that. And that's what that thing at the top right-hand corner implies.
Sorry, what thing? The external agent? Or?
Okay, so let me just be clear. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit here. So this is the paragraph I'm talking about here. Template substitution preferences are defined to be a set of rules defining how and what values are substituted into templates on a per cluster basis. For example, if cluster is cluster A, then image is blah, and replicas is blah. Or if selected cluster has label region equals Europe, then the secret to use is blah. So those are the preferences I had in mind. That's in the diagram, and that's the top right-hand corner in the diagram here.
So I think that to me is a little bit higher level than what I would directly, I mean, for me, the propagation mechanism I've been prototyping doesn't allow for weak associativity, like not if cluster has label, it's just cluster name value. The reason being is then if you want some arbitrarily complicated way of determining that very primitive substitution decision, it's completely arbitrary. The propagation mechanism does not have to change. And so you would generate the base resource out of whatever higher level resource you want.
So actually this top right-hand thing came out of your preference, I believe, that you specified, which is that you want to be able to customize the thing that gets propagated into each cluster. I think there was more than, so one of the obvious things is the number of replicas that goes into a given cluster could change per cluster. And I thought I understood that, configuration might change per cluster, and yeah, things like secrets or any data associated with the thing being propagated might be different depending on the cluster.
Yep.
And is your thinking that is simply like every cluster has a name, and that name is like embedded in either the secret name or the configuration name or anything else that gets propagated into the cluster? I thought it was more than that. So
I think it's not out of line with what you have here, what we're discussing. And I think maybe the confusion or like disjoint stems from the API brainstorming doc talking about overrides or substitutions in a specific way, and it used like a selector. And my thinking, and I think Paul's thinking, sort of evolved since then, so that we treat some selector-based associativity as a higher order thing, and propagation only focuses on a resource that consists of cluster name, substitution values, cluster name, substitution values. And there would be a controller if the user wanted to have this behavior be more dynamic, that would generate these resources. So that the propagation mechanism only had to understand template, placement consisting of a list of clusters, and override or substitution consisting of a mapping of cluster to substitution values.
Okay, so I think we've uncovered a fundamental misalignment of understanding that. So maybe I can describe my understanding, and we can see if we can come to some common agreement. So the thinking encapsulated in this diagram is that the propagation mechanism, the bottom left-hand ellipse, does nothing other than take specific, explicit Kubernetes resources and propagate them to clusters. And any template substitution that is required to generate those things that need to be propagated to clusters happens in the previous step, called template substitution. And so the propagator, the propagation procedure at the bottom left there, is not doing any template substitution. It's taking already substituted templates and just pushing them into clusters. So it knows like how to get to that cluster, what credentials to use to connect to the cluster, you know, what the API endpoint of the cluster is, and it just takes that thing and pushes it there, or pulls it. So that propagation mechanism could actually be sitting outside of Federation, could be like sitting in the cluster, for example, but conceptually it does exactly the same thing. So maybe that's where the confusion is arising.
I mean, when we talk about substitution outputs as labeled in the document, is that referring to resources that exist in the API, or just resources that like?
It's a Kubernetes resource. It's a Kubernetes resource with an explicit named cluster associated with it.
Right. So it's not like an actual. I mean, in the key, it talks about like consumes, procedure, generates API resource. You're talking about an API resource that just sort of exists in space, not the one that's been serialized to like any API where you would watch it or anything like that. Does that differentiation make sense?
I don't quite understand what you mean.
So if I was to, like, if I'm looking at Go code and I'm like, you know, secret equals, you know, core v1 secret, and I define like basically an instance of a secret as a variable, but I haven't serialized it. I haven't gone, you know, client.create or anything like that.
You're saying it doesn't exist in the API?
Exactly. So that's sort of the differentiation I'm trying to make, is that the substitution outputs they don't exist in the API. They've been created, like, they represent the form of the resource that we want to exist in the underlying cluster, and the propagation mechanism will create it. But there's no intermediate step where it's serialized, and then the propagation mechanism will read it out of the API.
So that is what is in, the latter is what is envisaged in the document.
That is not what I'm intending at all.
Okay. So then the question is, how do, so the thinking was to, you know, disassemble these pieces as you requested, so that we could have different substitution engines and different schedulers and different properties.
And that's still the intent, but the goal is in defining the resources that would drive any propagation mechanism and any scheduling or, go ahead, sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. So this gets back to Irfan's question, I think, is what happens if you don't want to produce all these API resources? And I think the answer is, if you want to build a combined propagator and template substitution controller for a given resource type, you can do that, and you don't have to produce those intermediate outputs. But then you cannot replace your propagator with somebody else's propagator, and you cannot replace your template substitution with somebody else's template substitution. And I think that's fine. Yeah. I think that's fine. So I think the spec allows that. And maybe I need to make that explicit in the document, that exactly like what happens if you decide not to generate any of these API objects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the utility in sort of defining template placement overrides sort of dumb resources that are composed via a propagation mechanism, and it could be that it generates configuration for kubeApply, it could be that it's kind of similar to the Federation V1 reconciler. But it would consume, any of those mechanisms would consume those objects and then send the form that was desired to the clusters that were requested. And just to me, that it satisfies the property of being composable, because then you can have arbitrary ways of deciding overrides or substitutions or placement. And you can have arbitrary ways of deciding how to take the composed resources and do something with them. I guess the tension might be, because I'm not really thinking so much from the automated level at this point. I'm trying to sort of do a sort of a bottom-up reimagining of this. But I guess when I think about it, I don't see why you couldn't have a scheduler that did automatic scheduling that would boil down to these resources and then have a propagator, like, because to me, propagation doesn't seem entirely simple. There's all kinds of corner cases and gotchas. And I'm not sure having multiple implementations of the same thing makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying people can do whatever they want, but if we have a propagator that's effective at propagating arbitrary types and can handle all the corner cases, it means that there could be more focus on, getting a really good scheduler implementation in place, or getting integration with, cloud resource orchestration or something like that, rather than you just treat the propagator as a given and you can do like more stuff on top of that.
I'm not sure I mentally digested all of that, but I guess in the background I was thinking that we have at least 3 proposed propagators at the moment, I think. One is, kube control. So kube control could basically, or a bash script, a very thin bash script wrapped around kube control, which could read a bunch of resources out of GitHub, which would be your substitution outputs, and push them into the clusters or pull them into the clusters. So people have described such a thing as being desirable. Then we have something more akin to the current the current Federation implementation, which is an active controller, long-running thing, which is watching an API and either pulling or pushing things into a cluster. And then we have more of a sort of a one-off workflowy type thing, which might be Spinnaker or something else, which similarly, one of the final phases is to push things into clusters. So I think there is a clear requirement to have more than one kind of propagator. So if I understood you correctly, you were sort of advocating for only having one, and then focusing on the other stuff. And I think that's not consistent with what people have asked for.
That's not what I'm suggesting, no.
Okay.
I mean, the idea would be, like, I'm focusing on sort of the case that I understand, which is more like a Federation V1 style reconciler.
Sorry, let me just interrupt you very briefly, Maru. I think we're technically out of time now, and I think people are going to start getting kicked out of rooms. Should you and I take this offline and talk about it today and tomorrow, and then hopefully we can still like finalize stuff by Monday, which was the plan. Because it seems, I think we're roughly on the same line. And if you can hang around on this call, I'd be happy to stick around here. If everybody else wants to leave now, I'm sure some of them are going to get kicked out of rooms, so they will leave anyway. But let's do that.
Okay. And then for anybody who's concerned they're going to miss things, I mean, we'll boil this down and have a synopsis in the document.
Yeah, and hopefully this whole thing has been recorded. I hope it doesn't get truncated at 10:30, but we'll see. It probably only stops the recording once the meeting gets terminated, which I think.
I think it will be recorded for the whole duration.
Okay, cool. All right, sorry, carry on, Maru.
My thinking is that all of these propagation mechanisms haven't, like, the common element is still like, I need to know the base representation, which clusters the resource should appear in, and some sort of way of defining per cluster variation. So if I have standard ways of representing all three, then any propagation.
So just to be clear, sorry to interrupt you. I don't think the per cluster variation is actually has anything to do with propagation. I think that's substitution.
It's not, well, but I guess my suggestion is that the substitution can be 2 layers. Like, to me, if I have a propagation mechanism that can compose a resource for a given cluster, right?
But that's
as long as
a substitution. What you just described is different. Yeah.
I guess, but there's 2 sort of layers to this. One is something that is so simple that it's dumb, like it doesn't require any processing or intelligence, and there isn't really a need for providing special capabilities because it's just the lowest level primitive for allowing per cluster variation. And if you want something more complicated, you can have a layer on top of that that generates that base level representation out of whatever you want. And so my conception is that I want to sort of have, because the propagation mechanisms will tend to be the reconciler loops, they'll tend to be like what everybody will be having in common, even if there's 3 different versions. That's kind of like, that has to be rock solid. That can't be buggy or error prone or whatever. That's the shared piece. So let's get that right. And then if you want to have a new and novel way of doing substitution or producing substitution output, when I say output, I'm not really talking about an API resource that would appear. Like, I shouldn't use that terminology. Let's call it like a substitution decision, just to be parallel with like how we've described temp preference, like placement preference versus placement decision. I kind of think of the same way of like substitution. I think of substitution preference, which could be selector based or, you know, more dynamic, versus substitution decision, which is cluster name, value that should appear in the template for that cluster. And if I separate those, then the propagation mechanisms can just work on the decisions, the placement decision, the substitution decision, and the template. And then everything else can be handled, you know, arbitrarily. If you want to have a specific way of doing substitution, of generating substitution decisions, if you want to manually do it, doesn't matter to the propagation mechanism, whichever one you're choosing.
So Maru, you were saying that that base kind of resource or the lowermost layer would be an actual API resource which will be serialized in Federation, right?
Sorry, say again?
What you're saying about the substitution output, what we are referring to is, and that being the lower layer, or that being the most simple kind of resource, that will be a resource in Federation and will be serialized, right? It will be an API resource.
It will be an API resource, but the reason I'm a little bit confused is in the document, substitution outputs appears to be like, if I had a federated replica set and its placement and its substitution resources, and I would actually generate substitution outputs that would be essentially like a replica set.
It's a Kubernetes, that thing is intended to be a Kubernetes replica set. And,
right.
and something to say, this thing must go into a named cluster.
Right. So the concern I have with serializing, sorry, go ahead, Irfan.
Yeah, so the representation of that could be as simple as one API spec, which has a field, which is a cluster or cluster list, and and internally has a or represents the Kubernetes API resource.
And by the way, there is actually already, unless somebody removed it, there is actually a cluster field in the metadata of every Kubernetes resource, just as an FYI. So in that, assuming that field has not yet been removed, I think there was some talk about perhaps removing it. That thing that is currently called a substitution output could be precisely a Kubernetes resource, like zero difference.
So this is in conflict with the implementation experience that I have. The idea that you actually generate a replica set. The reason being, I guess the conflict has to do with if I am joining the hosting cluster. If I have a namespace foo, I mean, I wish I had a whiteboard for this, but if I have namespace foo and I have replica set, federated replica set X in that namespace, if I was to be federating into that namespace, because I've joined that cluster, like I would have like for each cluster, I would have a namespace, or I would have a replica set that represented the form that I wanted to appear in whatever member cluster. Mm-hmm. And I guess you could do it if you name things, like if you had some sort of name form that would differentiate it from the resources you actually wanted to run. But the conflict for me is that this may be a functioning cluster. And so if I create a replica set, even if I name it something unique to differentiate from the actual workload I want to run, like to me, it adds a lot of potential for confusion because I have a federated replica set. I generate replica sets in the same namespace.
Okay, I understand your concern. I guess my thinking was that down in the brass tacks implementation details, the stuff that Federation stores is actually stored currently in a different etcd than the stuff that the host Kubernetes cluster stores its stuff in. Now, I'm not saying we have to do that in future, but logically that's like where that answer. So we
can't do that though, because that would require having a completely separate Kubernetes, because essentially like the deployment as envisioned in Fnord is I have the Kubernetes API, which will handle things like namespacing and RBAC, and any Kubernetes like resource. But like if I'm defining federated resources, that's a separate API server that's aggregated, and the only real link between them is the namespacing will be in common. And then I have the cluster registry, which is, so I have my API endpoints. But essentially, if I create a replica set, like if I talk to that aggregated API and I create a replica set, I'm creating it in the host cluster, essentially I call it host cluster, even though it's not actually running.
I understand, and I don't disagree with that implementation. I guess what I'm saying is that the original thinking that I was referring to earlier.
Right, okay. So you're not talking about you want it to be that way. This is just kind of where you're coming from.
Right now,
okay.
We actually create a thing called a replica set in the Federation API, and it could have precisely the same namespace, and could be identical to a replica set in the host cluster, and there would be no name clashing, and it's very clear that one is a Federation thing, and it's called replica set, and it is logically a federated replica set. It has exactly the same name and namespace as a replica set in the host cluster, but that doesn't cause any implementation problems. However, I agree with what you're saying, which is that in future implementations, that may not be the case. So all of these things could be actually sitting in the same etcd, in the same logical API surface, and we would have to use some other mechanism to distinguish these two potentially identically named things. And maybe API groups is that thing. Maybe they're parts of different API groups.
But essentially, that would imply, like, to me, that gets into the same problem that we have today of confusion over which API surface is Kubernetes and which is federated. So the scheme I've been sort of working with is that a federated resource
has a name. Yeah.
there's no, like, if you create a replica set in that namespace because you're propagating it to the same cluster, then the replica set controller is going to run that workload. And so it's not just a matter of differentiating things that are going to different clusters. It's a matter of making sure the replica set controller in the host cluster doesn't go, oh, you just given me, 5 replica sets that are intended for different clusters, but I'm going to run them. Like, it's a lot more work to
solve that problem. I don't disagree with you. I absolutely agree with the problem. I guess I just don't see that it is such a big problem, in the sense that we seem to have many different ways to make sure that the Kubernetes replica set controller in the host cluster does not like read our stuff and think it needs to do something.
If it's a replica set resource, there is no way to avoid that from happening unless we essentially duplicate
I don't think that's true. I don't think
and again as an intermediate resource. But the problem is aggregation.
No, but hold on. Listen to me for a moment. So if that thing called a replica set in the same namespace is in a different API group,
how is it going to be in a different API group?
Well, we just put it there. Like we just put it there. And that's where we create the things. Then the normal Kubernetes replica set controller is not going to go and look in that API group and find it.
Okay, I'm understanding you.
Yeah, I thought that is how we are actually representing all the federated resources, or the resources which are going to be in the federated space, call them whatever. The API group essentially is different from the ones that are specified in the data.
And I don't claim to have a detailed design in my head of exactly how we should do it, but it seems like there's at least a few different ways we could feasibly do it, and we just need to figure those out.
I think it's less about how, and I think it's more about why. To me, I guess I understand more of what you're intending here, and I'm kind of struggling to understand.
I think the why is to answer your question, the why is to make propagation as simple as possible, so that it can have a very focused intention, which is to take like actual Kubernetes resources, modulo being maybe in a different API group, but they're conceptually exactly what needs to go into a cluster, and propagating them there. As distinct from taking a set of cluster placement decisions and some other logic that decides how those, perform some form of what you've been calling overriding and what I've been calling substitution, and what we're perhaps going to call something different, to generate those things that need to be propagated. And I think there's a lot of value in that distinction. I don't think that precludes someone from writing a single piece of software that runs as a single controller that does both of those functions, and does not produce the intermediate output. And I think that would be totally fine. And it sounds like what you want to do. And the only compromise that would introduce is that somebody using that thing that I just described would not be able to substitute at runtime their other preferred propagation mechanism. They would have to either use both of your things in the same controller, or throw them both away and re-implement both of them. And I think that's fine. So I think we have a way forward here. I think you can do what you want to do, what I understand you want to do, but I don't think that needs to be the only way to do it. I think having separate procedures for doing the template substitution and the propagation is fine. And if we want to be able to swap out the two pieces independently of each other, they need to have some rendezvous point in between, and that is currently called substitution outputs, which Irfan has suggested we call Kubernetes resources, which I think is a good idea. Yeah, I guess that's that.
I don't think that I have enough. Okay, so I will say that what you're saying is completely valid as an approach to doing things. I don't think I have enough. I haven't internalized this, so I don't know what the gotchas are, or like basically not the gotchas, but the pros and the cons.
Mm-hmm.
I've been kind of working from a slightly different perspective, and I don't think I could say this is something that I would be in support of or not.
Okay,
like
maybe you
right
want
away until I
think
have
about
time to
it.
sort of digest it and maybe even prototype it. Because frankly, like I have sort of, anyway, as you know, I kind of have maybe more of a pessimistic view of everything. So I'm like, oh no, this is complicated. Oh no, oh no. But
That is a valuable perspective. I tend to be the glass half full guy, and I'd need a glass half empty guy in the room to counterbalance this.
I'm your guy. Sorry.
All right.
But,
So maybe you want to think about that. I agree. I mean, I think some of these things do take a little bit of time to digest. Cool. Is there anything else that comes to mind that is like a major concern for you?
this is kind of dominating, so I can't say I'm going to come up with anything else at this point.
Okay, go and figure that out. I mean, I think from my understanding of, I think I have a clear understanding of what you want to do, and I don't think that what's in the document precludes that. I think it's perfectly valid implementation of this thing, and I need to explicitly add to the document. In fact, it is there. So the thing I'm thinking of is workflow procedures. There we go. All procedures. Oh no, I didn't actually put it in there. So I should add here. Add description of how multiple. I could have sworn it's in the document somewhere, but I can't find it right now. Procedures can be implemented in a single process/controller. Because I think that is pretty fundamental here. If you don't want to generate all these intermediate bits and pieces, and you just want to write one piece of software that does all of this stuff, or you don't need some of this stuff, but your single process implements all the stuff you need, like, for example, substitution and propagation, I think that should be totally fine, with the caveat that it's an all or nothing thing, so people cannot swap out the propagation part of it easily, unless you have a flag that's on your controller that says, like, don't do propagation, but then it needs to, like, output the stuff that somebody else needs to propagate somewhere somehow, and that's the bottom right-hand blue stack of things in the diagram. But I can add specific wording to the document to describe that. I think it's a perfectly valid use case, and I think it needs to be explicitly spelled out.
I mean, there's no logical reason I'm worried or concerned. Like, what you're suggesting is perfectly valid. I'm more worried about the implementation concerns, and kind of, to me, part of this is ensuring that it's scalable. Like, if I want to support a bunch of new types that someone is implementing, I want that to be a tractable problem. And I also want the user experience of, like, troubleshooting or working with the system to be as straightforward as possible.
Yeah.
So
I think one of the first things I would like to do, and I think I can sign our company up for this, is to produce at least one reference implementation of the sort of most complex version of what's described in this document, for at least one complex type. And I think deployment seems like the most sensible one of those. And hopefully that will uncover, implementation gotchas that we could not see when looking at PowerPoint slides and documents, because I'm sure there are some. And that'll encompass things like, the propagator has to do smart things like decide which cluster to propagate to first, and then maybe monitor and make sure that it's healthy before propagating to other ones, which is the standard kind of blue-green deployment stuff across multiple clusters. And it will also, and maybe we can run that propagator in the cluster and in the federation control plane and verify that that sort of potential implementation works as well. And so I think that'll create a very useful test bed for these ideas. And as mentioned before, if we come across stuff that is problematic, we just come back to this design and we say, turns out this thing is not tenable or useful in practice, and therefore we're going to simplify or increase the complexity of our sort of architecture. Make sense?
It does. I kind of think that that's working at a really, there's just that's a big problem space. When we talked about doing deployments and being able to do blue-green deployments across clusters, that's kind of been an active area of research. So my only concern with that would be that it's trying to solve one, maybe too many things at once. It's like we're trying to prove something out, but we're also trying to pioneer a way of doing cross-cluster blue-green deployments. And
Sure.
I'm not saying that's not useful, because it certainly is. We want to get there, but I'm not sure that conflating that with proving out this architecture would be the best way to do it.
Fair enough.
But I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just...
I actually stand corrected. Irfan, can you remember, I've got a feeling that we actually have an implementation of what I just described for federated deployments. I know we have the default
internally or in Federation V1?
Federation V1.
No.
So we have...
No, I don't think we have
Marcin
implementation of rolling updates kind of a thing. Yeah.
Marcin proposed something, and the idea was to
maybe it's just the design
track things. Yeah.
There's a design, outstanding design for that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. So we can certainly...
But don't do that, whatever you do. The reason it was done that way is because you didn't want to create a bunch of accounting, like resources that would do the accounting required, and he was proposing just to use replica sets to do that. But I think that now that you can create your own resources, there's definitely better ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, you might see that as complex, and that's fair enough, but I mean, that is like an absolute definite requirement to be able to do...
sure, yeah. It's more than like focused on proving out the layers to get to that point, and if trying to prove too much at once, to me, runs the risk of losing the value of prototyping the intermediate layers. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can tackle that. Maybe we'll factor out some of the more difficult pieces to later and do the easier bits first. I think that's totally reasonable.
Okay.
Awesome. So it looks like we're almost ready to call this round closed. Modulo, your inputs by Monday. And not closed in the sense of we won't take any more inputs, but closed in the sense of we're actually going to go and build this stuff now, or produce detailed designs and build. And it would be a valid, if someone comes back and says, no, that design is bad, it will be a valid response to say, well, it's consistent with what we agreed upon in the document. So either we agree that it is consistent and move forward, or we agree that it invalidates the document in some way, and then we, for example, if someone starts implementing something, discovers that what's described in the document is not tenable, and therefore comes up with an alternative approach, that would mean that we should probably come back to this and say the alternative approach is better and is now the preferred approach, and we put that in the document.
I mean, I kind of, the language you're using suggests to me like there has to be one way to do it, and I'm hoping that your intent isn't straying from having pieces that are composable. And if for some reason the interfaces between those is wrong, then that is definitely something we should correct. But my hope would be that as long as there's agreement on how things are going to coordinate, then how they actually get implemented, I don't think is really something we design. Like we'll have suggestions, we'll have approaches, but like my hope is if we can make this sort of a framework for implementing federation-like things, hopefully we can encourage participation. And I get your point that we need to actually have a framework for people to work within, and it's not there yet. I just don't want to stray from like avoiding being too prescriptive, I guess is my point.
Yeah, and I think we have hopefully struck the right balance here, which is that this is the full reference architecture, and you can, what's the right word? So you can merge multiple procedures described in this architecture into single controllers, processes, and you can thereby remove the intermediate API objects. For example, substitution outputs. If you implemented a combined template substitutor and propagator, you could not generate substitution outputs. And we described that in the document, and that's a valid implementation of this general architecture. And in addition to that, you can define defaulting or implement defaulting of some of these other API objects. For example, cluster placement preferences are not required, and the procedure can continue without them, etc. And put those in words so that it is clear this implementation is consistent with the architecture, and this implementation is not consistent. And maybe I'll actually put some concrete examples of consistent and inconsistent ones. Nobody is going to prevent anyone from implementing an inconsistent implementation, but it will be, explicitly inconsistent, and therefore won't give any of the purported, or will not necessarily give the purported benefits or features of the general architecture. Cool. Sounds good.
So I would have one more point to
Sure.
ponder upon. That is, so are we actually saying that we can have one place where the spec, at least the API spec remains, or can be converging into, it could be any location, like it could be an external repo, internal repo, whatever place or whatever way, and implementation of procedures or the workflow could be at different places?
Yeah, that's a valid question. I kind of been pondering it. I agree we need to decide on that soon, probably on Monday.
Okay.
The two options that came to my mind, which both have pros and cons. The one is there is now a procedure where you can get a SIG approved repository in, I forget where the actual, I think there's an organization, a Kubernetes organization, separate from the core one, which has a bunch of repos. And as long as you get SIG approval, you can create a SIG-owned new repo in there.
Yeah, that org is Kubernetes Federation.
Yeah. So we could build, we could create a repo there and do this work there, or we could incorporate it into the existing Federation repo that we have.
I think that's a non-starter. The vendoring requirements are going to be dramatically different, and I really don't want to have to mess with that in a single repo. So
I agree with you. It has the benefit that we sort of have a grandfathered in thing, which is like the official Kubernetes Federation. And it seems like that might be a good place to where a reference implementation of this might end up. I agree that it's not, I don't think we're there yet. So I think maybe as a future step, if there was a reference implementation in that repo that was part of the Kubernetes organization, that would be beneficial. I'd be happy not to do that yet, so we start outside. And secondly, it has the benefit of all of the tooling kind of works, and we have all of...
We don't want to maintain that tooling, though. I mean, I guess my proposal would be...
Well, we've got to maintain it somewhere, right? So we have
don't. That's the thing. The new API server builder stuff obviates the need. The whole point of it is that it's enabling the multi-repo future of Kubernetes, and if we cling to the existing implementation, we're essentially trying to maintain the old way.
I was actually thinking, I was thinking more along the lines of bots and CI/CD pipelines and those kind of things.
Oh, well, that's easy. Honestly, that's not hard at all.
Well, it took us like 2.5 to 3 months.
Right, but I mean, you talk about CI/CD pipeline. Part of that is just the overarching complexity of the existing deployment mechanism and testing mechanism, and we just won't do that going forward. We learn from our mistakes. There's much easier ways to solve the same problem.
Sure. But it's, if we create a new repo, somebody has to go and get the CI/CD pipelines working and get all the bots working so that we can do that. And that's just, you know, not super productive work in terms of producing a
We're going to have to do it anyway. I mean, it's a fundamental shift, the way things are done today and the way they're done in the future. And maybe that work has been too centered on Huawei's personnel, and I can see that being a problem, and I don't think that should continue. So
okay. I mean, I would certainly appreciate your helping set up a new repo. So can we tentatively decide now that we're going to create a new SIG blessed repo in the new SIG blessed Kubernetes organization, and that we're going to use that as the location for the reference implementation, we'll call it that maybe, which is not the, you know, the be all and end all and only one, but it is at least a reference implementation of the architecture, of which there might be any number of variants which are not reference implementations.
And what's the intention with regards to the prototyping work that's gone on in Fedora? Is the idea that that would be abandoned? Would there be an opportunity to reuse some of that code? I mean, it's not like we're going to abandon Federation. Lots of reusable code there too. You're just talking about starting fresh. Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry for interruption too. My intention was to at least, like we did talk about that, where we exactly converge, and we converge at the spec of the API. So my intention is sort of keeping the spec of the API at least at one place, whichever place that might be. I'm not suggesting anything specific, like it should be there in a particular repo or where, but at some common place. And we all sort of converge to that API spec. And for example, in this document, in the workflow, in the diagram, if you see, there are probably 6 different APIs, resources being represented over here. So we have definition, a converged definition of these resources over there. And if that happens, then we can have reference implementations or a single reference implementation, which we all converge on of the controllers. That's what my intention is.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Irfan, and I would like us to see the end result of this exercise be at least precisely those 2 things. So API specs that people can go and implement and write controllers against and such things, and reference implementation for the envisaged controllers, which need not be the only implementation or anything, but I think specs without reference implementations are notoriously unsuccessful. So we need at least one reference implementation, maybe more. And to answer your previous question, Maru, I absolutely think that the stuff that has happened in your private repo, whose name I've forgotten, what's it called again? FNord. I wasn't. I'm curious actually what that name stands for or means. Federation New Order or something, something like that, I assume. But yes, I think let's use as much of that as we can, and hopefully that can expedite, you know, putting stuff into this reference repo. And similarly, I think we can probably take pieces out of the existing Federation and reuse them as well. Probably not, you know, word for word, but certainly take pieces out of that and use those as the basis for the sort of early PRs into this new repo, so that we don't, you know, start with a blank sheet of paper. So make sense?
Modular details? Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's wrap it up. I think we've spent a bit of time. We see each other on Monday, and feel free to, I think we'll call Monday like the day we're going to like stamp this thing and say this is what we provisionally agreed on, modular changes in the future based on the implementation. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.